It's Friday, May 4th, 2018. I'm Leyla Vural, interviewing Miriam Frank at her home in Washington Heights in New York for the Stonewall Oral History Project. And thank you for doing this.
You're welcome.
So, all oral histories tend to start with the same question. Can you tell me where and when you were born and something about your early life?
Well, I was born here in New York City at Flower Fifth Avenue Hospital, which was on Fifth Avenue and 100th Street, so approximately around where Mount Sinai is. And my aunt lived in this neighborhood. My aunt and uncle lived in this neighborhood, and my mother, who at the time was living with my father in Newark, wanted to give birth to me in the hospital where she had worked as a nurse. And so she had her lying in with her sister. And then they whisked me back to Newark. And that's where my parents raised me, and then my brother, who came 13 months later, and then my sister, who was born in 1951. We all were raised in Newark. We left Newark when I was we left Newark in 1957. My father and mother were refugees from Nazi Germany. My mother left Germany late in 1939. She had passage to England, passage only. She worked in England for a while, and then she got on a boat and came to New York. My father, I think, arrived in the United States in 1937. I'm not sure when his parents came after him. He had he told me different things, and I know the dates, something like. But his father had been incarcerated in Buchenwald temporarily right after Kristallnacht, and my father's father, that's my father's father, and my mother's father had also been taken to Buchenwald. There was a whole thing where the Nazis took the leading men of their communities, and my mother's father was from Mainz. That her family was Mainz am Rhein, and my father's family was settled in Munich. They didn't come from Munich, but they were in Munich. So these were different communities that had been incarcerated. At that point, Buchenwald was a concentration camp and nothing more. But that was bad enough, and I think they were trying to see what they could get away with, because it was a very different turning point. But it was, of course, very dramatic. And recently, we've done the ancestry thing, and we found a ship's manifest with my grandfather's, with my father's with Adolf's name on it, and we found another passenger manifest with my mother's name on it. So that was documentary evidence. The rest of it I learned from just what they told me. I once attempted to interview my father, and the next morning, and we talked for about 2 hours, and I got some brilliant material from him. And the next morning, my mother said he was up all night with a pain in the stomach, and you can't do this anymore. And I didn't interview him on tape. I took notes. So I have that manuscript. My grandfather from my mother was already dead by the time I was born. And if he hadn't been dead, my parents wouldn't have found each other again. They were sweethearts in Germany. They were in the Zionist. There was a Zionist socialist organization that was preparing young people to go to Palestine and build Zion, and they were very enthusiastic about it. And it was what was going on in terms of young people. And on both sides, the parents said, "We're not going to the desert. You're going to have to find another way. If you want us to leave, you're going to have to find us another way." So there were relatives scattered in the United States, and they they went that route. So they knew each other there, and then they'd lost touch with each other. And the death notice of my grandfather was published in the newspaper that was circulated among German Jews all over the world, called the Aufbau, the Reconstruction. And there was a death notice, and my father was really bored. He was working in Richmond, Virginia, and his parents. They had a little mom and pop shop in the ghetto, and they were in Richmond, Virginia. And he like, what am I doing here? And so he's reading and he finds the death notice of my grandfather and my mother's name, and he says, "Hey, remember me?" And they married, and he moved his parents back to Newark, and they had started out in Newark, and then he moved them to Newark, and I came along very quickly thereafter. And my brother, like I said, 13 months, we were Irish twins. So that's early stuff. We were very poor. There were times when my mother had to have credit at the grocery. My father was a wage worker. He was in a union. He worked in an industrial silver, it was a precious metals refining plant owned by Charles Engelhardt. And Engelhardt was, just this great industrialist in New Jersey, a very liberal guy of German heritage, anti-Nazi. But my dad was the first Jew he hired. And then my father's name was Werner. And Werner just started telling Mr. Engelhardt that he had some other people that would be very good, and they were very good. And so that's how that workforce got integrated. And my dad was a union leader. He became the secretary treasurer of the union. And the union he was in was a smelting factory and a precious metals refinery, was the Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers of America, which is one of the red unions, one of the unions that was destroyed when the CIO kicked the unions out. And so after that, the guys in the shop joined an independent union, which was the Jewelry Workers of America, International Jewelry Workers of America, and they were mobbed up, and so they withdrew from that union, and they didn't know what to do. But it was a good shop, and they had good contracts, and so they had a courtship with two unions before they chose. So one union was the Teamsters, the other one was the United Auto Workers. My father was for the auto workers, and he was the secretary treasurer, and the president of the union was Johnny O'Grady. He wanted the Teamsters. But my father prevailed, and it didn't do anything bad to the friendship he had with Johnny O'Grady. They called my father at the shop Murphy, because when he first started to work there, and this was in the middle of the war, and he said, "My name is Werner Frank," they said, "What kind of a name is that?" And he looked at the guys who were, he'd been hired already, but he had to make it, in the shop. And he said, "Oh, that's an Irish name." And because there was O'Grady and there was Flanahan and all that. He said, "It's an Irish name." And they said, "Well, we'll call you Murphy." So that was his shop name. He was a very, he must have suffered terribly in all kinds of ways in his life. But he, at least, he was happiest being happy, and so he did things that made him happy insofar as he could. He worked very hard. He had a couple of sick days in the course of his 28 years at Engelhardt's, but not too many. So, ask another one.
So what were you like as a girl?
I had very curly hair, and I was the oldest. I was the firstborn child after the Holocaust in the entire... Well, my mother had nieces. I had a niece and a nephew who lived up there on 181st Street. But basically, I was the firstborn child in America. So I was a very lucky child. I was truly beloved. I was and I got it right away. I mean, I just charmed everybody, and I was pretty. A lot of my positivity is pretty much in my bones. And my brother was, he was very, I dominated him. I mean, he was my toy. he was, uh, he was very sweet, extremely shy. He was very happy not to, take the lead. I think secretly he knew that because he was a boy, he'd get it all in the end anyway. Who knows? But we were compatible. We still are. He lives in Oregon, and I'm very lucky to have him, even though he's not very nearby. And we had a sister who died in 1997, named Judy, and her life was rough. And we're going to talk about what you want to know about, the gay life in New York, and so I'm gonna. There's other documents of her life.
We'll let her rest.
Yeah, we will. That's well put. Yes.
And when you think about it now, given that your parents were quiet about their past, how do you think, or do you think?
My mother wasn't quiet at all. My father, I think, they probably went through terrible things, but he just didn't want to talk about it. It would hurt him. My mother talked to me in English and told me her biography. I mean, she told me about being in school. She told me about the anti-Semite around the corner who ran a bakery. I mean, she just told me everything about her village life, her relationship with her sister. I mean, she didn't start telling me about Holocaust stuff until I asked. And I was about 9 or something like that, maybe 10. And she had just gotten the Book of the Month Club. It was William Lloyd Shear's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And she said, "Here, read this." And that was really kind of an off. I mean, I could read it. I mean, I had, I was a completely competent reader, but the information in it was just horrible, and I didn't really know anything of what I was reading, but even as I remember it, it just sort of comes back to me, and I think I still have the copy of that book up there on my shelf. I can't quite part with it because it was such a marker of losing innocence in some ways, to know that's... But it told me what happened. I was just too young to know it, or... I don't know. People I know who grew up in survivor families or in refugee families learned a lot of things that were very, very harsh for them to know. So, and then I asked my mother, "Well, what is this?" And she said, "You don't want to know about that, She realized she'd gone too far.
And how do you think that affected how you thought about yourself and your place in the world?
Oh, over time, I've had bad memories that I've adopted from movies and plays and books and history, and just a second.
So, again, you don't have to answer anything.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about sort of how you experienced your own sexuality as a kid?
Well, I don't recall having much. Well, I had two experiences of being, two experiences that I remember of being abused sexually as a child. One happened in Weequahic Park, which is, or Vic Park as we called it. Weequahic Park is in Newark. And my girlfriend and I, we were probably 6 and 7. And we went with my brother and her brother, who were both younger brothers. We were two girls, and we had both had younger brothers. And we went as a foursome up a hill and down into an area that was forested. And we told her, because we wanted to see the Indian Trail. And my mother was taking care of my infant sister at the time. She said, just come back soon, you know. And a guy met us on the trail, and the first thing I remember is he was doing something weird, and then I realized, well, I didn't realize what he had. He just had this big schlong in his hand, and he said, let me show you where to go. And the boys immediately broke and ran. And Barbara and I, he took our hands and made us touch him. And I don't remember saying anything to him. I just remember that I remember the feeling as I'm telling you. And I remember breaking away with Barbara. And I remember just running. And we finally caught up with the boys, and he was not following us. And I remember not being able to scream. And for a long time I felt terrible that I had not called for help or anything. And just about 5 years ago, my karate teacher, and he knew this story, I had told him this story before, and he said, I said, you know, I really have to have a good yell. I have to have a good karate yell, because there was this incident where I hadn't been able to do anything. And then he said, you know, it's good. You have a good karate yell, but you know, you actually were yelling, except it was your feet that were yelling. You were running. You ran fast enough to get away from him. So is that what you're talking about with?
Well, actually,
That wasn't about being attracted to any girls, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
And there was also an abuse situation in school where a little boy. Well, I was going away from the bathroom, and this boy was going downstairs. He was brown skinned, and he was African American, and he just came up to me and he pulled up my dress and pulled down my pants, and then he went to the bathroom, and I got dressed again. And I told my teacher, and all of a sudden the vice principal was there, and she took me around to every classroom in the school to point him out. And when we got to the 5th grade class, I saw him, and the vice principal made all the boys who were Negro stand up on the side of the desks. You know, the desks were all nailed to the floor. And I saw him, and she said, as she had asked me in 4th grade and in 3rd grade and in the other 5th grade, do you see him? And I said, no. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and that's why I never got beat up. But that was, I mean, if I'm going to remember anything about sexuality, those are early traumas. So I could take you to Girl Scout camp.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
So tell me, do you remember when you first were interested in girls?
I was always interested in girls.
So can you tell me about that?
Well, I just liked girls better than boys. I mean, that was the way you do it, you know. I didn't have any boyfriends, and I had my girlfriends. I mean, that was the only boy I liked was my brother. Really. My cousin, but he was an older man. He was he was 6 years older than me, but no, the only boy I thought maybe I could marry him someday, but my mother said that wasn't going to go, and I was very disappointed about that, because I didn't like any of the boys I knew, and I just liked girls. I drew pictures of girls, you know. I never drew pictures of boys, and I don't know in terms of cartoons. I mean, I just, you know, cartoons were about ducks, you know, or something like that. So we moved to Maplewood, New Jersey, which is, we were in the, right on the edge of Irvington, which is a working class suburb. But we were over the border, and the schools were better in Maplewood. And I was in the Girl Scouts. I'd been in the Girl Scouts in my synagogue, but I was in a suburban Girl Scout troop. And in the summer I went to camp. And it was a beautiful place, and it was a magical camp. And I remember there was a I don't want to call her a girl. I don't want to call her a woman. There were teenage women who were counselors in training. They were the seniors. I was like the very lowest, the youngest group. And this one senior woman, girl, this one senior girl was friends with one of the kitchen helpers who was a very butch dyke. She had her cigarettes in a rolled up undershirt sleeve. Her name was Betty Franco. So I identified with her. I thought, oh, Franco, okay. She had a DA haircut. She swaggered. She had a big butt, and she was muscular. And there was just something about her that, like, oh my goodness. And she smoked. She used to smoke down by the waterfront. I mean, if people smoked, I didn't see it, but she just would, light up. I mean, none of the administrators were there, but, and she wasn't one of the campers. She was sort of middling. She liked being up there. I'm sure she liked being up there because she was attractive to so many of the younger girls. I don't know, but there was something about her swagger that really, as you can tell, impressed me. And I had crushes. I mean, Girl Scout camp is where I could freely indulge in my love for all these girls who were not my sister and not my friends from school, and we were on an island. There were no boys at all. There were men. There were handymen, and they all had families back in town. And this island was this perfect, gorgeous gem of an island in Saranac Lake, and we never saw boys. And if we wanted to see boys, there was only one opportunity, and that was singing in the church choir on a little church island they had there. So I would go, and I would, oh yeah, we're going to see boys. But I really didn't care about it. I mean, these boys didn't look like anything I wanted to see anyway. And in the meantime, we were the choir, and it was just girls harmonizing, which was, a great pleasure. And I had by the time I was 11, I mean, I had picked out crushes, stuff like that.
And how do you remember feeling about that?
Thrilled. Just thrilled and free. I mean, my parents weren't around. There were a few girls who were from school. I mean, we also told dirty jokes. I mean, it was just it seemed to me to be just heaven. And I think the stress of boys was really not there. It wasn't so much that there were girls there. There's girls everywhere. But there were girls there and no boys. Ever. And I'm in the Alumni Association. Raised money for the camp. It's it was pretty magical and pretty wonderful. And I went there for, I think, from 11 till about 15 years old. So every summer I had an August of, I didn't have my family, I didn't have boys. It was really great.
Do you remember a time when you were sexually attracted to girls or young women, and how you felt about that?
Well, that started happening at camp. I mean, the crushes? You mean, do I remember my first crushes?
No, like later when you would be able to kind of act on it. And
well, I didn't feel like I could act on it in regular civil society. So there was a friend of mine who I was quite crushed out on, and she loved me very much. I had a couple of girlfriends that I really loved, but this one, there was something else going on. And in fact, we both are lesbians. And it never worked out, but it's been a complicated relationship. And we're still in connection with each other. She's an attorney, and she thought I was so funny, and I thought, I mean, she just made me laugh. She was so fun. She is so funny, very talented, very smart.
Can you tell me about what brought you to New York? When did you come to New York?
Oh, when I graduated high school, I got into, I applied to a few colleges. I had my heart set on University of Chicago. Thank God I got turned down. And I got accepted at Barnard College and at NYU. And if I had gone to Barnard College, I would have had to commute from Maplewood. And there were commuter trains, but they didn't have dorm space for anyone who lived within a 40-mile radius of New York City. And my friend's mother, my mother had no, I mean, my mother didn't really understand this stuff, but Mrs. Lowenstein said, Miriam needs the dorm. She needs to be with other girls. She needs to not do, I mean, the commuting, that's terrible. And so Barnard's a great college, but no, she should go where she can be in the dorm. So I did. That's what brought me to New York. And NYU, I went to NYU in the Bronx, which is today Bronx Community College. But it belonged to NYU, and they had an undergraduate college of arts and sciences and an engineering school. And Mrs. Lowenstein was right that the dorm was very good for me. And at that point, I was really trying to. I had a boyfriend in high school that I really loved. Of course, he's queer. But I loved him very much, and I'm in touch and not in touch with him. But I mean, I know where to find him. And he was a darling human being. And he broke up with me because when he went to college a year ahead of me, he was getting involved with his roommate, and he couldn't tell me. He said, we can't see each other anymore. Why? What? Huh? I cannot speak about it. It was very romantic, and it broke my heart. And then I started looking for boys when I was in the dorm, you know, and they were all terrible. I'm sorry, they really were, and it just wasn't working out with this one, with that one. I mean, I'd get into a make-out situation with one of them, and I wasn't really interested. And then I had a thing. The first guy I had sex with, he's so queer. We're best friends forever. But we had an affair. Meanwhile, he was having an affair with his roommate. This was 1965, 6, 7. So I knew that there was gayness. I knew that I had these forbidden desires for my girlfriends. And I was trying very hard to be heterosexual. But I always ended up with gay guys. That happened like 3 times, that they were trying to prove that they were not gay. So was I. I mean, it wasn't a very good formula. And there was a lesbian woman who showed up in our scene, and I've written about her. She was the friend of my best friend, and she had been in college with her on the West Coast, and she came to New York to come out. And she sure did. I mean, she was gorgeous. She was tall and gorgeous and very, very smart and very mystical. So that was my first thing, which didn't go further than a very kind of disastrous make-out session, and I told her to leave the house. I mean, I just couldn't take it. We went a little bit, and I thought, oh my God, what am I doing? And my sister is crazy, and this is clearly, and being a lesbian means that you're mentally ill, and my family can't take it to have 2 mentally ill daughters. I had just the worst set of defenses, and I just didn't know what to do with those things. So eventually I went to a shrink. He was useless. And then I met, and then my friend that I had this thing with, she said, let me at least introduce you to someone who's like a good guy, and he's not weird like these guys who were coming out, and he's not like the boys that it's not like the boys that you're finding here at NYU. I know him. He's very political, and I'm sure he'll like you. Well, we did, and I married him. Reader, I married him. So I married him. He married me. I married him, and he was in New York, but he wanted to get a degree as a social worker, and he'd been accepted at Wayne State University. And I said, okay, I'll come with you. By that time, I was just starting graduate school. But I'll come with you, and I'll just try to, do something about my graduate school there. And he said, if you're coming with me, you have to marry me. Because he'd been dumped by a woman that he'd been with for several years. And he thought that if I married him, he would be safe. So, and I thought, okay, we'll go to Detroit. That's fine. I'll marry you. I was in feminist consciousness. I was in feminist consciousness raising groups then. That was very difficult. That I was suddenly going to leave New York and move to Detroit and get married. Everyone thought that was just hideous. I mean, we're talking about 1970, 71. And I thought, well, if I get to Detroit with Rick, there won't be any lesbians there because all the lesbians are in New York. So I'll be safe. And he had plans for us to start a family, but I didn't realize that he wanted to start a family like next year. And he was older than me. So that was But I did find out that I was wrong about the women in Detroit, because it's true that everyone I met in 1970 and 71, just about all of them were in relationships with men, married, trying to work it out and so on. But by 1973, everyone had broken up. Everyone came out. It was really a phenomenon because it was starting to be okay.
So when let's go back to New York a little bit. So you knew some gay men, or maybe you didn't know they were gay.
We none of us knew what we were. I mean, we used terms like bisexual. We didn't know what gay was. I mean, maybe some of the guys did, but we were just sort of flailing around. Everyone read the Village Voice. The thing that we read the most were the personals. There were people talking about what they wanted to do with you. It was a very sexy time, but it wasn't that gay a time.
And were you otherwise political? Were you?
I was very political. I went to the Alternate U, which, have you ever heard of it? Yeah. I went to Alternate U, and we had they started a consciousness raising group every 6 or 7 weeks. You'd have a 7-week consciousness raising group. After that, they'd say, if you want to continue the group, you're going to just find other places to meet because we're going to start a new one. And I don't know who was really in charge of it. Maybe nobody, but we followed it wasn't a syllabus, but we followed the guidelines from the Red Stockings. And we worked on abortion rights. And I did go to the dorm that I had lived in college, and I spoke to the girls in the dorm about abortion rights. That probably was the first time that happened on that campus. A friend of mine had an abortion when I was a freshman, and it broke her. It just broke her. It was a legal abortion, and she had to prove, I think, 6 times or something. I don't know how many times. She had to go to many, many psychiatrists before she got enough write-offs that it would be endangering her life not to have an abortion. And she was getting more and more pregnant during this whole time, but she did have an abortion, and she dropped out. And her life wasn't that messed up. She came through that, but at the time it was. She was in bad shape, and my mother talked with me. I said, I'm getting involved in. I believe in the right to an abortion. And she said, "Oh, that's very good. That's wonderful, Miriam." And she started telling me about how in the 20s in Germany that there had been abortion rights and women's rights and the campaign to undo paragraph 218, which was the abortion, the law that forbade abortion, that it was a popular movement. And she told me about all this stuff. I said, "Wow." She said, "I wish they'd had paragraph 218." Well, I won't say that, but you know, she really she said, "We had feminism. I'm glad you're doing this." I was very nervous about telling her. I thought she might find it interesting that I was doing it, but I had no idea that she was. It was more than she thought it was good for me. She recalled how good it was for her.
And do you remember when the Stonewall riots happened?
Of course.
Can you tell me about that?
Oh, yes. Well, like I said, I had this one boyfriend who was mostly, I mean, we were trying to keep, his roommates wanted him to be straight because they were anxious about him being gay. And so we were set up with each other. We like each other very much. We still do. But we were set up with each other. And so he called me. That he got involved in political stuff and anti-war stuff. And I wasn't following that level of ferocity about anti-war stuff that he was. And he called me one night and he said, "Miriam, there was a big riot at the Stonewall." And I said, "What at?" And he said, "That's a gay bar I go to." And I said, "Were you there?" And he said, "No, but there was, and I'm going down to the village because there's going to be another demonstration." And all that week there were demonstrations that went from the bar to Washington Square Park. I think I had read about it that morning. I was on my way to work. I wasn't in school anymore. And I was on my way to work, and I remember seeing something in the New York Times. I think it was on the front page that there had been a raid and all that. Maybe it was inside. I can't remember. But I thought, oh. And then later in the days when he told me about this stuff. And I had another friend that was gay from when I had studied in Germany. I had been in Berlin. I had been in Freiburg, and we took a week-long trip to Berlin. You know, all those closeted gay kids there were 6 or 7 of us, and we all went to a gay bar. That was the first time I went to a gay bar, was in Berlin, and I didn't know what I was seeing, and I didn't know what it was about. I mean, it looked like a bar, you know. I mean, I didn't get sexual vibes from it because it was guys. But we went to it. That's my first gay bar. And so one of the guys from that particular group was also involved in the Stonewall riots, and his name is Richard Koob, Koob. And I mean, he's had a great experience of gayness and openness in his life. And so, yeah, I remember that. I didn't identify with. I mean, bars really didn't interest me. and I told you about this one lesbian that I had this very unexplained relationship with. She always went to a bar on Union Square called Kooky's, Kooky ''S, and like the Stonewall, like all the gay bars in New York, it was a mafia operation. It was a lesbian bar, and again, I've written about that in a fictionalized memoir that I'm working on. so I knew there were. I mean, but the bars didn't interest me. I'm not a drinker, and I always felt uncomfortable in the bars. Later on, when I lived in Detroit and I was out, I went to bars, and I got to be good at it. You know, but that was after I broke up with my husband and came out. Finally, 70. We broke up in 74, and I went directly to women. I mean, I wasn't gonna. I mean, I knew what was going on.
And at that point, you felt like you could.
Well, it was 1974. I mean, it was, and there were gay people in Detroit. there was, there were Detroit had been Detroit had been a major center for gay culture in the Midwest, and my friend Tim Retzloff in Michigan, wrote a dissertation that fat about the gay life in Michigan, the gay history of Michigan. His book is it's not gonna be that fat when it's a book, but his book is in the works. And I was free. The thing about being in Detroit is that nobody knew me from the past. No one knew me from college. No one knew me from my family. No one knew me from the neighborhood or Girl Scout camp or anything. I was just out there with this husband, but I was out there. And the feminists were all considering the alternative. And I was sort of part of that development.
Stonewall, do you remember kind of the aftermath?
Yeah. Well, I was outside it. I was living in the Bronx, and I was involved with my boyfriend. And I told him about these things, and he really was. He was a radical. He had been really involved in the civil rights movement. A white guy from a fine family. So he was definitely a political liberal and a radical. But the homosexual side of it really was he didn't get into that. He wasn't interested. He didn't feel supportive, and he may not have felt secure that was going on. But I never really interrogated that. But so I knew it was going on. I mean, I read the Village Voice. I read the Evo, the East Village Other. I was down at NYU 2 or 3 days a week because I was taking graduate classes in the German department at the time. And it was just part of the mix, to tell you the truth. I mean, I saw the slogans painted on the walls and the flyers. I knew there was a homophile organization at Columbia. I had a brief affair with another guy who was trying to prove that he was not gay, and he went to the homophile organization with this woman I was telling you about that went to Kookies. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on, and I was aware of it, and I didn't look for it, and I didn't avoid it, and I thought, this is interesting and this is good, and is this for me? Maybe not, but I didn't shy away from it, and I was very happy for the Stonewall riots. A year after Stonewall, there was a march that went uptown from the Village to Central Park. And it ended up, I think, on the Sheep Meadow, around 72nd Street, a big sort of be-in. And that afternoon, I was with my boyfriend, and he lived near that part of Central Park. And my other friend, who was gay and was going to these things, had called me up and said, I'm going to be up there. The march will be over. Why don't we meet each other in the sheep meadow. I said, that's very convenient because my boyfriend had the measles. And I'd been staying with him and taking care of him, and I figured I could take a couple hours off and hang out with Richard. And I think I have to take him out with that name. Let me just say this again. I figured I could meet him later. I could hang out with my friend, and while I was taking care of the guy with the measles, because he didn't need constant care. He just, it was just nice that I was there. So I went across the street, and I go over to the sheep meadow, and all of a sudden there's this huge mass of people, and it's like a be-in. I mean, we'd had be-ins in Central Park, but everybody was gay. And I saw someone that I knew, and he said, "Oh, Miriam, I didn't know you were gay." And I said, "I'm not." And then I went around for the rest of the afternoon thinking, is that true? Put it away. And then the news cameras came out. It was a Sunday afternoon, and this was going to be on the Sunday evening news. So there was a woman and a man, and the newscaster said, he goes into they set up the cameras. And all this time, there was a lot of complaints all over the community, the queer community, which is not what they called themselves then, but around the community, about media and the lies that they tell about us and the lies that they tell about gay life. So this guy comes out and he says, the boys and girls in the band came out today in the sheep meadow at Central Park. They had a march all the way up Fifth Avenue. I think it was 6th Avenue. They marched up 6th Avenue. And somewhere in the middle of when he said this, I realized what he was doing. And I just yelled at the top of my lungs, "Fuck you!" Louder than that. And Richard was, my friend just goes going like, "Oh." I said, he probably was going to try that again. Sure enough, he tried it again. This time it was my friend and me. We both said it. "Fuck you." And then people saw what was going on. A little crowd gathered. And by the time we had the third "fuck you," there was a little gang on these people. And the newscaster puts his thing down. He says, "I'm trying to make a broadcast about this very important piece of news." And out of the crowd pops Martha Shelley, whom I'd seen here and there and everywhere. I was very impressed with her. And she just starts running her mouth about the media and the lies that they tell and whatever gave you the right to come here and make us into something that you're going to sell soap with. And I don't know what all she said, but she really let him have it. And she was really completely armed with a very wonderful and very powerful speech. And she was like that, And I thought, all right, okay, that's great. You do that. You go, girl. And so they took their camera to someplace else. We just followed them around. They finally I don't know what they ended up doing. They probably took their cameras to where nobody was, and they'd already probably made footage, but it wasn't what they had wanted.
That's a great story.
It was a cool thing, and I felt like, oh my goodness, I did something for the movement. Even I'm so glad I've been able to help them. But I actually felt that it was also me. Not me as a lesbian, just me as someone who was an advocate for the movement. And then I went home, or went to my boyfriend's house and took care of his measles. So that's how that happened. Many years later, when I was in Detroit, and after I'd broken up with him, we were married for 3 years. I went to the first, maybe it was the second, rally for gay liberation in Detroit, and there was no media, and it was in a park, and everybody was just, this thing is at the end of June. It's just a wonderful time. And I just thought how wonderful it was. I knew I was coming out, and here's all these people, and I'm a little bit scared, so I'm not going to really be that friendly with the women. But the gay men were very friendly, and I eventually found my way to admitting it and coming out and having a very silly, first time where I really wanted it and someone really wanted me, and it was in the back seat of her Honda, which is a very small car, but we we had a good time, and I was still married at the time, but I was pulling myself out of that. I never got pregnant, and he was really mad at me, but we never talked again. We didn't talk again because when we broke up, I did all the work for the divorce. I mean, I was living with a guy and two lesbians. The guy was a new attorney who had run a law clinic at Wayne State University. And he challenged the city ordinance against accosting and soliciting. Okay, A&S, which was, men offering each other for sex. And there was always, the cops would entrap people and they'd get their arrest records up. And he took those things to jury trial. He took those cases. I mean, usually what happened is some lawyer would get paid off, some lawyer would pay the fines and hush it up. And he said, no, I'm going to make jury trials out of this. He wasn't gay, but his brother was one of the original. He was part of the original collective of Detroit Gay Liberation. So he was basically defending his brother's friends. And he lived in our house. And so I was coming it was weird, but that's how I got in. That's how I got into the life. That's how I got into the life. Yeah. And I continued with all my feminist work. I had started the women's studies program at Wayne County Community College. There was this lesbian sociologist, really uptight woman, but she wanted to have women's studies in the sociology department, and she wanted to make it women's studies for the community. She had an idea that it would expand to not just sex roles. I mean, terrible names for these courses. The sociology of sex roles. And she wanted to, and I said, how about women in literature? Because I had a master's degree. So I was someone that she wanted to have working on that. So I taught at the community college women's studies. I mean, I started doing that in 1972. It was the first women's studies program in an urban community college. I think middle-class suburbs had women's studies in their, some place like Westchester Community College would have had that. But it was a different population that went to Wayne County Community College. It was all working class. It was mostly black. And I wasn't teaching lesbian studies, but the lesbians who were in the room always knew what I was. They had me picked out. I mean, I wasn't dressing very feminine at that time, and those classes were really just, they saved my life. I mean, it was a job. The house I was living in was a condemned row house, but it was nothing wrong with it. It's just that the city wanted to tear them down to build new housing. And so they didn't repair these things, and they charged us, I think, $60 a month rent. And then the only real expense was the heating bill. That was it. So we could live very poor. We could do work. We could work part-time. We could afford to repair our Volkswagens. It was a very nice time. There were food co-ops. It was kind of a hippie scene. And no one there knew me. There was no family there. I mean, there was some uncle of mine out in the suburbs where we went for Seder, at Passover, and I put on a skirt. But otherwise, there was no one there who knew me from before. And I could make myself, I could reinvent myself in a very free place. And Detroit was a lot like Newark. So I felt, I don't know, that what had been taken away from me when I went to this weird social suburb, that I was back in that in some kind of way. Detroit and Newark had their urban rebellions, the same within 6 weeks of each other. The same sort of wreckage was going on in those communities. I mean, it was tragic, but I felt okay in Detroit in many ways for quite a long time.
Well, it was a combination, it sounds like, of working class and feminist, sort of the things that were really important to you, that were both newly comfortable and...
Well, I think what was going on in New York with feminism is that all these famous women were, New York had this whole big media scene, and a lot of academics and a lot of famous writers. And the really cool thing to do was to go to a book party for Kate Millett's Sexual Politics. Sorry, Kate. Sexual Politics. I mean, we would go to these things, but the famous feminists were, they were famous. And so the rank and file feminists were they were doing their consciousness raising, anti-war stuff, supporting gay rights. But there was this whole level of existence that you get to Detroit, it's just, it's just the regular socialists, running an abortion hotline that were, it wasn't with famous people at all. It was just, there was basically, it wasn't as bougie, not one bit. And so I missed a lot of things about New York. But I didn't miss the feminism of New York. Wow, these are just regular people dealing with, we all came out at about the same time. And there were lots of arguments and quarrels and feuds. Sisterhood is powerful, but, it was not, I don't know, it wasn't as, it was pretty more down, it was down to earth. It was down to earth. That's where I learned. It's in Detroit that I found out about potlucks. Oh my goodness, we had potlucks. Oh, it was lovely. It was really lovely, and I had prominence in the feminist scene because I had started the women's studies program at the community college. Wayne State had some women's studies stuff too, but this was something very new and original, and no one had done it before. And we also had a Detroit Women's Health Project, which was do-it-yourself gynecology, and where we examined, this was not particularly lesbian, except, we were really interested in each other's bodies a lot. We took notes of what we saw when we examined each other every day. It was really fun, but it was really strange. And somewhere in the mix there, I started to drift away from my husband, and I experimented a little bit, and I saw that it was just fine, and then we broke up.
So I want to ask you a question about the be-in at Central Park.
It was not a be-in.
I realized it was the march that then kind of ended
on the sheep meadow.
You're right. Which others have described turned into a band. I've read that other places also. But was interested in, that was after the play The Boys in the Band had come out. And that was what the reporter was playing on. Right?
Yes.
And what about that, was there something about that specifically made you mad?
It just was so smarmy. First of all, a lot of us didn't. I never saw The Boys in the Band. I'm not planning to see it again, or for the first time. I read the play, and I read about it, and I thought, ugh, this isn't a nice play. This isn't going to tell me anything new. I mean, the fact that they're all gay but not telling each other that they're gay, it just didn't touch me. So, and that phrase, the boys in the band, was a media phrase. So, this guy thought he was, I mean, he had written that out for himself, and then we did that to him. Yeah. So what was in theater that I liked at the time? What were the movies that made a difference? I can't say that I can think of anything offhand right now. I actually was very, in Detroit, I got very involved and very excited about documentaries. I started working with the union, with the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union in Detroit, and there were three films. Oh, now I'm going to have to remember the name of the first one. It's the one with the three women, with Babies and Banners, and eventually Rosie the Riveter. I'm sorry, I can't remember this. I mean, you've seen it 100 times too.
I don't know.
It ends with a big funeral march in Chicago. Union Maids.
Okay.
Union Maids. Yeah. That's what it was called. It was called Union Maids. There were three veterans of the left who were old commie women, and they remembered organizing unions in Chicago in the 1930s. And it's an hour-long film. You haven't seen it? You would love it. It's great. It's real grainy. With Babies and Banners, you have seen the founding of the UAW in the Flint sit-down strike. And so those two films were there. And then in 1978 or 79, an organization in California started researching Rosie the Riveter. Eventually, I worked on that film. But before I did that, I lived in Berlin for more than a year in 1977. What happened in Detroit was I had this great romance, this great love affair. It went on for quite a long time. It fell apart. I'm still in touch with her. She's a great person. But my heart was broken, and I was finished with my dissertation. Meanwhile, all in the background, I'm writing. I'm getting my degree in German, knowing that I would probably never get a job because the ceiling was coming down, the floor was caving on foreign language scholarship, and German was really usually the second language to get the axe. So. But I was gonna because one of the things I was finding out about was that there was a feminist movement in Germany, and one of my friends had been in Berlin and brought me back a calendar called Frauenkalender 76, and I looked at it, oh my God, it's not just that I'm writing a dissertation about German feminism. It exists today. I mean, I was writing about German feminism in 1920, 24, before the Third Reich. But there was a movement going on. And I thought, when I finish this dissertation, I still want to do German. I still thought I had a chance. I'm going to go to Germany, and I'm going to, talk German with feminists. And I just showed up there. I knew two people. And I arrived with a little bit of money. I didn't have a lot of money, but my doctoral advisor said, you're going to go to Germany and you're going to study all this stuff, and we'll get you a little grant so that you can do journalism over there. And then I gave English classes in my room. I mean, I lived in a communal apartment to people who needed to pass language exams in English. So I did very well there because my expectations were just to have adventures and become fluent in German and meet all the German dykes. by that time I was out, and I wanted to, like, I wanted to have that. I wanted to see what that was all about. So I lived there from the spring of 77 till late spring of 78. Came back to Detroit, and things went very, very badly in my relationship, and I broke up with her, and I was very, very depressed, and a friend of mine killed herself. And I started looking around, and I realized that she was about the only friend I had a really intellectual relationship with. She was the only woman I had a really strong intellectual relationship with. There were a couple of men, and I thought, I can't stay here. And around about that time, these people who were researching women in the workforce in World War II were doing some filming in Detroit. And the director of that movie saw how I was operating, because I had been working with unions and culture and stuff like that. And she said, we're getting a grant from the NEH, and will you take the film around? We're going to show the film at film festivals. We're going to try to get it into movie theaters. It's going to be an hour and a half. But we'd like someone who can bring this to union meetings and community college classes, and all these. This is 1978. There's all these women's organizations, all these community things going on, and so I took it around to many. I traveled all over the Rust Belt, and also in the Southeast, in the cotton textile region, and we wrote a book on it, and The Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter, and that was exciting. I didn't get along with the filmmaker. There were a lot of things that went wrong, but I'm so glad that I got to participate in that project. It really was an opening, and it got me out of Detroit. I was in California for 2 years. Things didn't go, emotionally things weren't going very well at all. And I lost a job. The grant ended. I got a job on the night shift in a hospital. I wanted just a regular job. Being with all these film people really made me crazy. Not the production people. It was the people who were on what do you call that when your parents had when you have a bank account because you inherited the money?
Trust funds?
Trust funds, right. See, I don't even remember the word. That's very healthy. There were all these kids they weren't kids. They were in their 20s and 30s, and there was a whole world of independent documentary filmmaking. Not one of these people worked for a living. They all had something, grandma, whatever. And I didn't want to be around them anymore. Even though I wrote a couple of I freelanced and I wrote grant proposals for a few of them. But I went and worked on the night shift in a hospital, transcribing medical reports, which is something I had done when I was in college, and I was very good at it. And it was a really good thing to do for a few months. And then I'm ahead of myself, but it was a good thing to have done. But they found out that I was trying to organize a union in the typing pool, in the transcribing pool, so they found a way to get rid of me. And I was hanging around with all the trade union women in the Bay Area, and I was really not like the other women in the typing pool. Then there were these two people on my shift, these two women on my shift, and there was like a period of a tryout period, and then you got you were like on after 3 months of probationary, and I didn't tell anybody anything about myself, really. I was very professional and a little bit detached, and yes, I live in Berkeley, and it was like 3 miles away from the hospital. And the day that I got off probation, they said, Miriam, congratulations, now you're really working here. I said, well, I've been working for 3 months. They said, yes, but now you're here. It's permanent. I said, whatever that means, but sure, great. And, you know, for you, and now you're going to get a really wonderful opportunity. You're going to go to McDonald's and get burgers for all of us because now you've passed probation. So I got in my car and I got the burgers, and I brought them back, and they jumped up from their typewriters and they went, oh yay! But she brought the burgers. Oh, this is we had this complete pig out with the McDonald's, and somewhere on after the second Coke, yeah, I was high enough on that second drink of Coke to say, well, I really, and I started with the two that I liked the most, and I said, well, I really have to tell you something. I'm gay. And they said, we know that. Thanks for letting us know. I mean, they were so cute. They were so wonderful. But, and I was talking union to people, and so we need to let you go, Miriam.
So I want to ask you about...
But we have to get me out of California. Yeah.
Yes, and I want to ask you specifically, sort of as a... This doesn't directly get us out of California, but subject-wise, about kind of pride marches, because you were saying you started going in Detroit.
In Detroit, I went to Pride, there was one year that I went on a march, and we started out at, I think we started out north of Wayne State, maybe at the New Center area. And we marched all the way down to, there was this circus park, the Masonic Hall. We marched past the Masonic Hall, and then there was a green. And I was terrified because I was sure someone was going to see me that I was a teacher of. And then what? And my friend, my girlfriend said, I'm not going down there. She said, I'm not going on down there unless I'm wearing a paper bag over my head. I mean, it was the first time that there had been a march. There had always been a picnic up at Palmer Park. And Palmer Park was the gay neighborhood. And it was, just a very generous, wonderful, the men all sold fruit, I mean, it was really quite lovely, and no one bothered us. I mean, we all were very conscious. But to march, and there weren't that many of us. I mean, there may have been 70 people. That was heavy. I only did that once, New York. And I think I must have gone to Labor Notes. I went to Labor Notes when I started working out in the union. When I was starting to gather, I wanted to get... I interviewed Howard Wallace and a couple of other people there. So that would have been in the very, very early 90s.
So I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember, and if so, can you tell me a story about when you were no longer afraid? When you weren't worried?
Oh, that's a great question. When I stopped being afraid? Well, it's a layered thing. I think, are we shooting?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that when I lived in Berlin, I wasn't afraid at all because nobody at all knew me. At that point, I was inventing myself. I was afraid as a Jew, but I wasn't that afraid. And I did have a couple of events that weren't so nice about me as a Jew. No problem. I taught women's studies. They wanted to have women's studies at the military base because they had a college. They had a community college that was connected to University of Maryland, and I taught women's studies. No, the woman who was teaching women's studies asked me to do a special day on women and organization. And I thought, really? I can do women and organization? Is it okay? I have a wonderful movie to show. It's called Union Maids. And I showed that at the army base. It's a communist movie. And these women loved it. Because, you know, who goes into the army? Lesbians. So they loved it. They loved it. They just loved it. And they never asked me back again. I was teaching German to the GIs. But that was a whole nother thing. But I want to get me into... So I wasn't afraid in Berlin. I was really out. I was really out there, and I was being outrageous, and it was really okay. And it was a very, very gay city. And I was having adventures, and I was loving that. And then when I moved to California, I was in the USA. I had my cousin was living in San Francisco, still does, and he had 6 kids. He'd married someone with kids, and he had 4 kids. They had 6 kids, and I showed up and he was building a new addition to his house in San Francisco, and I came over in coveralls and, you know, my hair in a kerchief, and I said, "Hey, I'm here to help you." I was not competent, but I was a hard worker. So he let me take nails out of the boards, and didn't let me do any sawing, but he let me carry things. And the kids got it right away that I was gay. And it was big. It was really big. And one of them said, "Oh, you know, he was talking to his older brother. He said, 'We're playing Smear the Queer,' which was some street game that they played in San Francisco. Smear the Queer." And my cousin, Michael, he said, "I don't want you boys talking like that. There's lots of people that you don't want to smear. Some of them are gay and some of them are not. And it's just not okay." I mean, he just gave them a talking to in front of me. And I thought, okay, my parents accept that I'm out, but I never wanted to figure out what was going to go on with the rest of my family. And I'm getting support from Michael, and he said, "Oh, come on. I mean, this is San Francisco, you know. Everybody's happy here, you know." So the Bay Area made me feel normal as a gay person, even though I didn't feel normal as a human being. There were some issues there. But when I came back to New York, and by that time it was 1982, so I was 37 years old. I was out. I'd had all kinds of experiences. I had traveled. I was no longer afraid. I think it was just those early, you know, when I first came out, 75, all those places that I went to be myself. So that finally when I came back to New York, I could be with my parents, and I could be, I could be gay.
And you could work and not be afraid someone would see you and you would lose your job, or...
Yeah, no, and by the way, another thing that made me feel not afraid, may I just say, thank you, karate. Thank you, martial arts, Thank you, Brooklyn Women's Martial Arts. Thank you, Jay Spiro with the Majishi Dojo. I mean, I was just around a lot of lesbians who made me feel normal. I would say it was I can't say one morning I woke up and I said, I'm safe. It was an evolution. And in some ways it really did get better. And I'm a strong person. And, I'd meet students who needed my experience, who needed things that I could tell them about. So it worked out okay.
So we don't have a ton of time. So I want to, but I also don't want to cut you short. So I want to think with you what you would like to tell me about that relates to your path, and doesn't have to specifically relate, but somehow to the path that people kind of think of Stonewall as the beginning of, which I know it wasn't the beginning, but
it was
marker in the sand.
It was a marker. It was an event. It was a breakout.
Right.
It was a breakout. And you want to know what
So when you think about your path,
My journey,
your journey,
which I'm still on,
yes.
which I'm still doing, I have to say that meeting Desma Holcomb and falling in love with her, and first we produced a booklet, and that booklet, the Pride at Work: Organizing for Lesbian and Gay Rights and Unions, it's a little pink staple-bound book. That was exciting, and we did this with the Lesbian and Gay Labor Network. I mean, we had a Lesbian and Gay Labor Network in New York. That was pretty exciting. So meeting Desma and producing that little book, and to tell you the truth, the day that that book came back from the printers was, I think, around about the time that Desma conceived Ruth. And we had gone to a couple of pseudo weddings at demonstrations, but we had this baby. And I had to struggle with people all the time about, well, who are you, and two mommies, and I can't tell you how many people gave us Heather Has Two Mommies. I mean, we had it, and then we got so many more copies of it. We just gave it away a lot. But, just being in the PTA as a lesbian mommy, and it turned out that I think of the five teachers that Ruth had in elementary school, 4 of them were lesbians. And the 5th was the sister of a gay man who was and she was dedicated to gay rights. So it was a public school, it was in this neighborhood, and it wasn't Park Slope. And I felt very safe. I always felt safe in this neighborhood because it's where I came to life, was in this neighborhood. So a lot of things worked out very well around that too.
Would you have imagined when you were a young woman that you would be?
I had no.
What sense? Let me ask you differently. What sense do you make of a lesbian life and a family, and how does that feel for you?
Well, when I was younger, I didn't see myself as having a lesbian life. I was just afraid that I had a lesbian life. But I always wanted to be a teacher. I am a teacher. I've taught in so many different venues, and I've been successful at that. And the more I've been out, the better it has been in terms of my honesty with myself as a teacher, I have to say. And I've had gay kids come to me all the time and talk about, oh, my parents, I've been very open with my classes, not bold and not, but I have represented myself. And certainly since I've been back in New York, I have represented myself, and it's been very good.
Is there anything you want to tell me about?
I'm just very proud that our daughter is so dedicated to gay rights. It's not about her identity one way or the other. She just considers it part of the necessity of justice. And she's a great representative. She was an officer in the Gay Straight Alliance at her high school. And she always said to me, Mom, it's the Gay Straight Alliance. And she was a leader, and she was very, very good for the kids who were coming from families that were homophobic, because she didn't have an ounce of it. And so she ended up being someone who really made that organization a strong one at her high school. So I'm proud of that we raised an organizer.
So I want to ask you, what are your hopes and concerns for the future?
Well, the future is right now, not next week. So I just take each day as it comes. I'm retired. I don't have to worry about the next class I'll be teaching. I have to worry about the future for the rest of the world. I mean, that really does concern me. And I also have to conserve my energy so that I do the best I can do with what I've got left. I'm 71 years old. And may I live to be 100 in good health. That could happen. But I want to keep on creating and talking and communicating. And this seems to have been a very good way to do it.
Is it meaningful to you that next year is the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots?
I guess the 25th anniversary, I remember that. You know, we had this giant flag and we were all carrying yeah, it's a marker. The 25th anniversary, we had our child in a stroller. The 50th, I think it's going to be one of those things where New York gets taken over by the world. I'll probably be very glad in the second week of July that it happened and that we made it through. And I'll go to things and I won't. You know, every day is an anniversary of, maybe it's the 50th year plus 3 days of the Stonewall Rebellion. You know, that it's a marker. And so it will change things. We'll understand new things. It'll be good.
Thank you.
Welcome. Very welcome. And I just want to say, can I say one more thing? I just want to say a shout out to that wonderful pair of couples down there in the village, Gay Liberation by George Siegel's sculptures, Gay Liberation. Every time I see them, and if I have a minute, I sit down next to them and I talk to them, or I talk to the guys. I just think they are great, and they've always been there, and I hope that they remain healthy as a work of art. And the rest of it is humanity, and we know what to do with that. So.
That's lovely.
Is there any way I could see some of this?
So,
Is there like, I'm
I
just
don't know how- I
just
don't
out
know
of
the answer to
curiosity.
that.